Today, if you're a developer, I'm going to show you how to become a better designer. Oh, and hey, I'd like to point out this video's awesome sponsor, Skillshare.com, which offers thousands of classes in design, coding, business, and more. For instance, you're about to watch this video on UI design, but you could watch this full course about UIs on Skillshare. Now, Skillshare is just $10 a month, but if you're the first 200 students to use my very exclusive link below in the description here on YouTube, then you get the first 2 months free. All right, so let's get started. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Conversational. So just the other day I was browsing around on the subreddit JavaScript and I came across this question here. As a developer, how can I become a better designer? I'm going to link this specific post here in the description here on YouTube and you can check this out. But this is a common issue that developers face. You know, they're working on personal projects, maybe funds are limited, maybe they want to be able to also design well and become a full stack developer as it is. And it's difficult because it's almost like asking, you know, as a firefighter, how can I become a better cop? I mean, they're very different, but they're also sort of related in a way. All right, so I came up with a great approach, I think, that's geared towards developers and trying to help you as best as I possibly can throughout this video, try to become a better designer and putting it into terms. We're going to have a fictional REST API for you to put into your brain in terms of creating great user interfaces. All right, before we get to that though, answer today's question, which is, are you a better designer or a coder? I'll go ahead and leave my comment here in the first pinned comment on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe and let's get started. All right, so here is our fictional design REST API, and as you can see, we are sending a post request to some fictional API /design endpoint. So this endpoint will only return a successful status code after receiving a payload or all the data that includes an object with the following properties set to true. And we can see they're all Boolean properties, and so that means true or false. All right, so when you adjusted or added or modified a UI element of sorts. So this could be a logo design, it could be the navigation, it could be the individual navigation elements that, you know, culminate to make the navigation. It could be the headline, a subheadline, a call to action, an image. It could be anything. Each time you either add, remove, or modify one of these elements that are a part of your UI design, you have to ask yourself, did you consider color and contrast, white space, alignment, scale, visual hierarchy, consistency, simplicity, and typography? And if you did, then you could set these all to true. All right. If you didn't, then, well, you're going to return a failed status code, or the API is, all right, or fictional API. And this is what you have to, you know, as a developer, get yourself into the habit of doing, especially when you're starting off designing. You know, once you develop the muscle memory, then this stuff, you're not really thinking about it so much. It's not in your conscious because it would be in as a part of your muscle memory or your subconscious. But when you're starting out, this is what you need to really think about. And, you know, again, you get this stuff out like in a notepad or something, or a sticky note on the side of your monitor, so that you can really pay attention to all this stuff. So again, this payload is going to look like this. All right, so this is your object. I don't know why I did this, just to make it more developer friendly. You want these values to be set to true. They're going to be false if you didn't consider them. All right, they're also going to be false if you didn't execute them correctly. So you could think of them, but if you really don't know much about each of these topics, then you're going to have a hard time executing correctly. All right, so I play tennis, and you know, there's a lot of players who know what to do. They're smart with the game, but you know, for whatever reason, they lack maybe certain physical abilities or whatever, and they can't execute, or they don't execute on certain shots, so they fail. So it's the same thing. It's not just enough to know what to do. It's also how you apply it. All right. So of course, that all comes with practice. So what we're going to do is I'm going to I went to producthunt.com and I picked out 5 of today's popular product, their landing pages, and I'm going to go through some of these 5 different landing pages with all of these different properties in mind and determine if they evaluate to true or false. All right, so here is our very first UI design that we're going to evaluate and make sure that the payload and all of its properties evaluate to true. All right, so as you're going to see, it's not just one payload we're sending. I mean, it's going to be a bunch of them based on each individual UI project and each of its components. So let me just show you what I'm talking about. The very first property we have here from our list was color and contrast. Let's first focus on color. The color that they're using is this, it's sort of like it looks like a mix between a blue and a purple. It works well, especially when you look at the other colors that are, as a part of this design, which is predominantly just white. So these go together well as the contrast. The contrast here works very well. For instance, if I went to the developer's tools here and I chose, for instance, let's get this background right here. And we find the background color here and we change it to something lighter. This makes it much more difficult to read. And so now we're getting to the territory of contrast, right? So the contrast would definitely have failed if they went somewhere that was much lighter with foreground elements that were white. All right, so the inverse is true. The opposite is true, of course, if it was a for instance, the foreground elements were dark and we had a dark background. So they definitely nailed the color portion of this correctly. So we can set that to true. Now, what about white space? All right, so when we're talking about white space, we can look at it in two different metrics. So overall, in terms of the container that's surrounding this element, obviously this is a very simple UI, and it does have a lot of white space outside of here, but what about in between each of the individual components or the elements in the UI? For instance, we have the headline right here, or the name of the site, which is Screenshot Guru. All right, so how much white space is between this element, the very next element, or the adjacent elements between it? Is there an equal amount of white space? That's one of the things you really have to pay attention to, especially as a new designer when you're trying to develop that eye and that muscle memory. Right here, Screenshot Guru, this doesn't seem like it's too close. So for me, that's fine. Take beautiful high resolution screenshots of any website or tweet. Okay, that's fine. What about beneath this though? We have one thing that the white space gets wrong when you take into consideration all of the elements from a vertical manner, from starting at the top right here, here, and here. It definitely does seem that it lacks consistency, and that was another one of our properties that that's a part of our payload. Consistency. In terms of the white space, it doesn't seem to be applied consistently in this particular design. What next? Alignment. Right now, this is such a simple UI. The alignment here is just completely centered, so that works for a really simple UI, especially like a Google landing page. What about scale? All right, so we can see we have scale applied to the more important parts. This sort of also ties in with visual hierarchy, which is another property, and I'll explain that shortly. The scale of this makes sense because it's the most important element, and in this context, it's a name. The scale of this area right here, the input text field, it works pretty well. It's pretty large, and that makes sense. The scale of this area, unfortunately, I don't think they can control that, being that this is a reCAPTCHA that they're using. It's pretty large and is competing quite a bit for the attention of the eye. In the scale, the buttons are fine as well. What about simplicity? This is very simple, so they get that right. And what about typography? I don't have a problem with any of the typography, but let's also talk about visual hierarchy a little bit. And so what is visual hierarchy in design? And it's not just, visual hierarchy is not just applicable to UI design. It's kind of like an overarching design fundamental or principle. And basically, you have to think of yourself when you're creating a UI design, what is the most important elements that are a part of that design? The most relevant and most important. Obviously, you have your headlines usually as a part of a landing page, or your subheadlines. You want to emphasize their importance through aesthetics. All right, so that can mean making things bolder. That could be dealing in the realm of scale, making them larger. That could mean taking into account color and contrast as well, and using all these different things to really reinforce a visual hierarchy. Right here, yeah, we have this screenshot guru, which is larger. That works well, but I think it would even be better to make this bolder so we can even more reinforce it. Because right now, you look at the site from a macro perspective and you just look at it, as a whole, you're not really sure where you should look. One thing that sticks out too much is one of the least important elements, which is this reCAPTCHA section here because of the color and the contrast associated with it, because it's pure white almost in the background. All right. One of the most important aspects, the most important, is the call to action, which is this enter URL here. Sorry, I can't talk. And you can see they faded it. No, it's the most important. The thing should stick out much more. You can make this completely white, at least the border, thicken up the border, make it completely white. And don't fade it into oblivion. This is the thing that people have to click on and actually use. Yeah, when you focus on it, they've changed that up, but really it should, it should grab your attention immediately, not be an afterthought or whatever. So in terms of visual hierarchy, they definitely is a false here. So there's a couple false. Mostly they get it right. It's very simple. So let's move on to the next one. All right, so this is a very standard sort of landing page that we have here. We have this header section. We have a hero section right here with a headline, a little bit of a headline right here. I'm not going to go through everything. This I like a lot. This up here, it just seems a little bit standard. This right here is more of like a new age sort of trendy thing with the Bezier curves in the background. I really like this section. But just going through that list again, what about color and contrast? Okay, so again, we're going to take a look at some of the elements. I don't want this to be too long of a video, but each element you need to send that payload. And you have to make sure that all of those properties evaluate to true when you're considering them. So color and contrast with the logo. All right, so color and contrast, if we're looking solely at the color, all right, so we evaluate this by looking at the background element versus itself, which is the foreground element. So we have this sort of teal color here, and the logo itself is pure white. It evaluates to true. How about white space? So there's an equal amount of white space from the very top of this logo to the very top of the browser. All right, so that works, as well as the very bottom to the very bottom of this section that's containing it, the header section. So that works well. The navigation isn't too close to it, so there's a good amount of white space here, and obviously over here as well. Very good. So now also another thing to take into consideration is when we're working with UI designs is and the responsive considerations. How do those different properties react when you're looking at it on a phone, for instance? Perhaps based on this type of CSS they're using, white space might get all screwed up. Let's just check it just for the heck of it. Let's drag this in and see what happens. All right, great. So it still keeps its white space here as we're dragging this into like a tablet size and also in the phone. So it works great. So, you really have to evaluate it from many different aspects in terms of the viewport. What about, let's see here, alignment. Now, alignment, you have to kind of consider multiple components a part of the UI. So this is aligned here. This stuff right here, if we're talking about like a column and a vertical alignment, it starts right in the same area. Sometimes I see new designers, they don't get the alignment part right, so they just kind of position things, maybe way over to the left or a little bit to the left, but it's still noticeable, and that really breaks the consistency, which is another property, in the flow of the design, and it screws it up. That's one of the things that you may not be aware of when you're new, but you're aware of it though subconsciously when you look at other designs, and when they get it right, it looks great. So scale is fine with this logo. It works fine in terms of the size. What about now visual hierarchy is one of those other properties that you have to take into consideration, other elements. Let's see, simplicity. The logo itself, I'm not going to get too much into identity design, but it seems pretty simple. But what about typography? This is where it gets wrong. Looking at this, at least, it seems like, well, it might be because I'm looking at this on a 1920 by 1080 resolution on a 4K monitor, so things look a little pixelated. But to me, the health might be a little bit too thin of a weight in terms of the font. So that's just a minor gripe. But then, as you can see, we need to start evaluating all that same payload: color and contrast, white space, alignment, scale, visual hierarchy, consistency, simplicity, and typography with all of the other elements. All right, I'm not going to do that because it's going to take forever. But going forward, maybe throughout this design, I'll just pick out what I think is wrong as opposed to what's right, and instead of continually going over these properties. Right here, I have no problem with this. I like this navigation. It works well. It's a little bit, in terms of contrast, it's faded out a little bit. It's not 100% contrast, which would be white, but you can still read it easily. It's fine. This call to action button color, it complements with this blue, this green, quite well, so that works. As you can see, everything else is looking pretty solid here. The typography is a little bit strange on this. I understand they're trying to go with something different with this type of font, but I don't know about it. I'm not too sure about the underline either. But still, in terms of just core design fundamentals and not trying to get into subjectivity, it looks pretty solid. So looking at this, I think everything so far. I mean, this is great. These card-based designs. There's a lot of good white space here all around. Again, that's one of those things the new designer gets wrong. They would typically either give yourself too much white space, or they would put things a little bit too close to the containers, and that just makes things look like crap. So this is all pretty solid right here. Very solid example that pretty much gets that entire payload correct for the most part. Let's check out another one. All right, so O.school, one of those new trendy domain names. Looking at this, the thing that I see that probably would get a false, that's catching my eye immediately, would be consistency and white space in relation to this part right here. So what I mean is really these two parts in relation to the amount of white space that's showing up at the top, from the top of the originals right here into the bottom of this navigation, compared to the white space from the bottom of this section right here, the sub-headline area, to the top of this section. So you can see it throws things off. So there's a lack of consistency. All right. So if I hit Control-Shift-I, I select this area, and I put in maybe a margin top of 1.7 EM. At least it's more consistent in terms of the amount of white space from the top of this element and to the bottom. Now, I think this is probably too much on desktop resolution. You could probably get away with it a little bit. Maybe just bring them down by about 30% less on the bottom and top, and it would be better. But still, this, in my opinion, is better overall than this. All right. Coming down here, these are card-based designs, quite popular in the UI design world. What am I looking at? I just realized, I just read this, and it says, oh, God. Watch me get a community strike for this or whatever. Yeah, this was just from producthunt.com. All right, producthunt.com, not what you thought I just said. But these card-based designs they work well. Again, it's one of those things, if you're a new designer, that you may not be conscious of, but still you look at it and you can see that looks great. The reason it looks great is because they nail a lot of those things correctly. So color and contrast for these cards, pretty much almost 100% contrast with the white background, black here. This is slightly a different color for the paragraph text, but still that kind of plays into visual hierarchy. They're separating the headline right here through priority by using design and color and scale. As you can see, this is larger because it makes more sense. This right here is just kind of like a tag of sorts, so it's small. They use text transform uppercase on it, and they used a different color to separate its importance. So the most important element as a part of this whole card right here obviously would be the photo, and then the next would be this headline right here, these headlines, and the next after that would be probably this section right here, and then the originals, it's much smaller, and then get started would probably kind of fall after this area right here. But they also have great white space, which is padding within this particular container, and good use of color. That makes sense. The visual hierarchy, as I just mentioned, works great. It's simple. And the typography works well as well. All right, let's check out another one. All right, so this right here, all right, conversational landing pages. The first thing that is sticking out to me, probably similar to the last example, is inconsistency with white space. So we'll just take this element, which is probably an H1 element, and we'll put in margin top 2EM. Probably even go further. All right. So this makes a hell of a lot more sense, and it makes a massive difference by just pushing this element here down, this headline, the subheadline, and the call to action, and away from the logo, which is kind of competing for space. You don't need to, at least in this resolution, this viewport. So if I refresh that, look what it used to look like. Makes more sense to me to center something when you have nothing else at the bottom, and it definitely improves the landing page. Outside of that, though, the color and contrast gets a true. White space, again, the white space for the most part, if you look at the other elements, everything is pretty good here in the white space. There's that one issue with white space at the top that would get a true outside of that area. Alignment. Right now, everything seems to be aligned. You kind of have to take into consideration the whole UI, and things are aligned here pretty well, in my opinion. Also, what about scale? This is good scale for this area, good scale for the subheadline. Get a demo, get a demo call to action here that works well. This is all good. Visual hierarchy, again. This is important, so it's bold, it's large. Secondary is this, and get a demo. Might be worth maybe considering, using a different color on this, but it still sticks out pretty well. Consistency, how are they applying the typography and all of the different aesthetics? It looks pretty consistent to me. They're not mixing fonts up too much and changing styles across the UI. Simplicity, very simple and effective. I like it. And then typography. They're actually using a mix of serif versus sans serif, and that works well. So these would all evaluate to true. All right. Now, how about this one? This is going to be our last example, by the way. All right. So this is probably the worst example, where a lot of those properties as a part of our payload would probably evaluate to false. So the first one, color and contrast. Looking at this from a macro perspective and just the whole UI design as a general, the colors. All right, so I like the header. I mean, the header's the most simple part, I would say. A black background, white text here. You have a primary color, which works well with the background. It contrasts well. Everything is pretty solid up here. Then we get to this hero section where we have this very vibrant color or a mixture of colors, kind of sort of like an abstract background. In and of itself, it could work depending on what you're placing on the foreground. And here in this context, we have two different cell phones. A lot of things are happening here. There's a ton of colors, and it's creating a clash. When you have all these colors in the background, it's not simple. It would be better if you're going to use something that's as complex as this to have a solid background color for the background. next up would be this section right here, and they're getting this way wrong. It's probably one of the worst parts. Let me go back. Sorry about that. Of this UI design, and this is the headline and the subheadline and the call to action. So right now, where this sits is behind this yellowish area, and it's white text, and it doesn't contrast enough. So if we're looking at these elements right here with, those, what is it, 7 different criteria, the different properties as a part of our payload, it gets almost all of them wrong. Color and contrast, no, it doesn't stick out enough. There's not enough contrast here in relation to the background that it's sitting on. White space, the white space, it has a lot of white space from this element. This works well from the left. From the top, there's a ton of white space, almost too much in my opinion, especially when it's inconsistent white space from the top of this element and at the bottom of this element in the top of this text versus this whole section right here in the bottom of it into the bottom of the viewport right here. That's inconsistency. What about alignment? One of the things that's thrown this off is that we're starting off this large UI design with choose your device. These two elements right here and here are they're centered, and then we have a 2-column layout where this section is left aligned. It's just not evaluating to true, in my opinion. Visual hierarchy. Again, this you're not really sure where you should look first because they're not using design aesthetics to really reinforce that visual hierarchy. Choose your device, iOS, Android, this black line. There's so much going wrong here. It's hard for me to really give a great critique of this. Consistency, again, it's wrong here when we're talking about this Android. Again, look at this. You could barely read Android based on the background right here. So a lot going wrong here, unfortunately. The rest of it actually doesn't seem too bad as you scroll down, but this stuff up here, completely, no. So hopefully now that I've gone through a few of these examples, you can kind of understand that, as long as you think in that mentality that you have to really, stick to the forefront of your mind those different properties, and make sure that you really consider them, and you also understand what constitutes effective use of them. Once you do that, you're going to understand your designs are going to improve very quickly. Another tip I wanted to give is design inspiration sites. So if I go UI design gallery on Google, you're going to see a bunch of different UI design galleries and inspiration sites right here. Of course, we have very popular, which is Dribbble. We have Behance as well. And then a lot of these other niche ones. So like Collect UI. There's a famous saying, and I can't remember exactly what it is, but one of the biggest tips I can give you, and I've given this before in my on the YouTube channel here, I'll link the video if I can remember to do it, is to copy. And I don't mean to copy and produce your copy or launch your copy and put it out there. I mean to copy in the sense of trying to develop muscle memory. And obviously, you don't publish these designs. So let's say, for instance, something really catches your eye. You think it's great. And you think to yourself, I would love to be able to design something like that, like a UI or whatever. Let's say, for instance, I don't know, I'm looking around here. You would love to be able to create a dashboard from scratch by yourself that looks like this, right? Well, one of the best things that you can do, while you first understanding, those 7 different principles that I mentioned, and trying to keep those at the forefront of your mind, one of the best things you could do is to hop into your UI design application. That could be Adobe XD, Sketch, Figma, whatever, and recreate this. Just recreate it pixel by pixel, element by element. And once you're done, just delete the damn file. You're done, whatever. It's really just an exercise. And the reason I say to do that is because while you're, the physical act of replicating design and actually doing and positioning things and trying to get them to look right, the physical act of doing that at a subconscious level helps you become a better designer. All right, and this isn't just applicable just to design or whatever. This is for anything where you're trying to master something that requires time and effort and energy into. Like, for instance, playing guitar. You learn different songs. It helps you become a better guitar player, especially even when you're trying to write your own stuff down the road. And so, like you said, muscle memory is very important, and doing is very important. Reading books and all that stuff and trying to get into the theory of everything, that's great. But the biggest net return, in my opinion, is doing. And initially, as a part of your routine of trying to become a better designer, should include just copying great design. Now, what do you know is great design? This is a tough one because it could be subjective, but it's also a logical fallacy to say that, because I could say, well, you can go to these UI design sites, sort by popular, and then just try to recreate those designs. That doesn't necessarily mean just because something is popular, which is argumentum ad populum, that it's better. But if you're brand new and you're starting out, chances are, if you're trying to replicate designs that the community currently, make sure everything's current, really you probably can't go wrong. All right. So again, go to these UI inspiration sites, check them all out, see what they're doing, and try to really get yourself involved in the community of design if you're a developer. And like I said, it's a two-step process in my mind. First, it's understanding those basic principles that I just mentioned, and I tried to, create a sort of an idea that a developer would understand in terms of the whole REST API stuff. Understand the fundamentals. Don't spend a ton of time. Don't think you have to read books and stuff on all that stuff. Just try to understand what constitutes effective color and contrast, white space, alignment, etc., as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, and then start doing. And a part of doing would be to take some of these designs that you think are great and just recreate them. And when I mean recreate them, just use, you could change up the logo name or whatever, or, whatever, but just try to recreate them. And that's going to help you. And if you do that for a few weeks, maybe once a week or a couple times a week, and then you start to try to develop your own projects, you're going to see that, especially if you compare them to your initial attempts before you had this information, it's going to be 1,000 times better. Yeah, you may take some ideas from other elements, but it's still going to be your own, especially when it comes to design. So many people are reusing patterns as it is anyways. So the most important thing, though, is to remember those core fundamentals and apply them to each and every UI element. All right, so hopefully you found that useful. If you enjoyed it, make sure you subscribe and also answer today's question, which is, are you a better designer or a coder? I'll see you guys soon. Goodbye.